No one noticed the moment a billionaire quietly changed a stranger's life with a single swipe of a black card. But what led to that moment would leave everyone speechless. But a better hook would be this. 30 seconds before the boarding gate closed, a desperate mother ran out of time, and a stranger with a black card made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. Sophie Bennett could barely feel her hands as she stood in front of the airline counter, her fingers gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles turned pale, her wallet lying open with nothing but a few crumpled bills that didn't even come close to the $742 ticket flashing on the screen in front of her. The number might as well have been $1 million, because to her in that moment, it was completely unreachable, and behind her, the line of passengers shifted impatiently, rolling suitcases across the polished airport floor, checking watches, avoiding eye contact because no one wanted to get involved in someone else's problem, especially not here, not in a place where everyone was rushing somewhere important, somewhere that mattered more than a stranger's crisis. And Sophie swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she asked the agent if there was any cheaper option, any later flight, anything at all. But the response came back flat and practiced, the kind that had been repeated 1,000 times before. "I'm sorry, ma'am, this is the last flight today," and those words landed heavier than anything else because she knew what they meant. It meant missing this flight meant missing her son. It meant being too late, and suddenly the noise of the airport seemed to fade into a distant blur as her mind raced. Calculating, hoping, braking, she pulled out her phone, dialing the same number she had already tried, friends, co-workers, anyone who might help, but each call ended the same way, voicemail, hesitation, or quiet apologies, and with every second that passed, the clock above the gate felt louder, ticking down what little hope she had left. 28 minutes, 27 minutes, 26, and Sophie pressed her lips together, fighting back tears because she didn't have time to fall apart, not here, not now, but her body was already giving in, her shoulders shaking as she stepped away from the counter, defeated, invisible. Just another person the world had no space for. And a few feet away, unnoticed by almost everyone, a man stood still, watching, his expression calm but unreadable, dressed simply, nothing flashy, nothing that would suggest the kind of power he actually held. Alexander Hayes had seen moments like this before, moments where life came down to seconds and dollars, moments where one small decision could redraw the entire future of a stranger. And yet, he didn't move right away. He simply observed, as if weighing something deeper than money, something tied to a memory he never spoke about, while Sophie sank into a nearby seat, burying her face in her hands, whispering to herself that she had tried everything, that she had done her best, but sometimes best just wasn't enough, and that was the exact moment Alexander Hayes finally stepped forward, not with hesitation, not with doubt, but with a quiet certainty that this was a moment he was not going to ignore. Alexander Hayes did not rush. He did not call out to her, and he did not make a scene. Instead, he walked with a calm, measured pace that somehow cut through the chaos of the airport, as if everything else had slowed down around him. And when he stopped a few feet from Sophie Bennett, she did not even notice at first because her world had already narrowed to the sound of her own breathing and the quiet, repeated thought that she had failed. But then she heard his voice, low and steady, asking a simple question. "Is that the last flight out tonight?" And Sophie looked up quickly, startled, brushing tears from her face as she nodded, unable to form a full sentence. And the man's gaze shifted briefly toward the departure board, then back to her, as if confirming something only he understood, before he asked another question. "How much is the ticket?" And Sophie hesitated because the question felt almost unreal, like something you would hear in a story, but never in real life. Yet she answered anyway, her voice barely above a whisper, $742. And for a moment there was silence, not awkward, not heavy, just a pause that felt intentional, as if he was giving her space to breathe. And then without another word, Alexander turned and walked directly to the counter, his presence immediately changing the posture of the airline agent. Not because he raised his voice or demanded attention, but because there was something about the way he carried himself, something composed and unmistakably confident. And he simply said, "I will take care of her ticket," as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. And the agent blinked, slightly confused, glancing between him and Sophie, before nodding and beginning to process the payment. And that was when Alexander reached into his wallet and pulled out a sleek, black card, placing it on the counter with a quiet, almost understated motion. But the reaction it triggered was anything but subtle. The agent's expression shifted instantly, her posture straightening as she handled the card with a level of care that Sophie had never seen before, typing faster now, more attentive, more precise. And Sophie stood frozen a few steps away, her mind struggling to catch up with what was happening, because nothing about this made sense. Not the man, not the gesture, not the sudden shift in energy around her. And she took a hesitant step closer, her voice shaking as she said, "Sir, you do not have to do that." But Alexander did not even turn around at first. He simply replied, "I know." And there was no hesitation in his tone, no expectation, no need for recognition, just certainty. And when he finally glanced back at her, there was something in his expression that made her stop speaking entirely. Not kindness in the way people usually showed it, not pity, but something deeper, something that felt almost personal, as if this moment meant more to him than she could understand. And within seconds, the printer behind the counter began to hum, producing a boarding pass that moments ago had felt completely out of reach, and the agent handed it over with a polite smile that had replaced her earlier indifference, saying, "You are all set. Boarding starts in 15 minutes. And Sophie stared at the paper in her hands, as if it might disappear if she blinked, her heart racing, her thoughts colliding. And then she looked back at Alexander, her voice breaking as she asked the only question that mattered, "Why would you do this for me?" And this time, he faced her fully, holding her gaze for just a second longer than expected before answering quietly. Because someone once needed help, and nobody showed up, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them. Something that carried the weight of a story Sophie had not heard yet, but could somehow feel. And then just as quickly as he had stepped into her life, Alexander Hayes turned slightly, as if preparing to walk away, leaving behind a moment that was far from over. Sophie Bennett stood there for a moment longer than she should have, her fingers tightening around the boarding pass, as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. And as Alexander Hayes began to step away, something inside her refused to let the moment end like that. Not without understanding, not without at least trying to hold on to the reason behind what had just happened. So she took a quick step forward, her voice still unsteady but stronger than before as she said, "Wait." And he paused, not immediately turning, but slowing just enough to acknowledge that she had spoken. And when he finally looked back at her, there was no impatience in his expression, only a quiet attentiveness that made it easier for her to continue. "I do not even know your name," she said, almost apologetically, as if asking for that detail might somehow be too much after everything he had already done. And for a brief second, it seemed like he might choose not to answer, like he might disappear into the crowd and let this remain a moment without identity. But then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and said, "Alexander." Nothing more, no last name, no explanation, just a single word that somehow carried weight, and Sophie repeated it softly, committing it to memory as if she knew she would never forget it, and before she could ask anything else, a voice echoed over the airport speakers announcing that boarding would begin shortly, snapping her back to the urgency of why she was there in the first place, and her heart tightened again, not with panic this time, but with a sudden rush of gratitude mixed with disbelief, because just minutes ago, she had been preparing to walk away with nothing, and now she had a chance to make it on time, to be where she needed to be. And she looked at Alexander again, searching his face for something she could hold on to, some clue that would make sense of all this, but all she found was that same calm presence, steady and unreadable. And she asked one more question, quieter this time, "How can I ever pay you back?" And that was when something shifted, not in the environment, not in the noise around them, but in the way he looked at her, because for the first time, there was a hint of something deeper, something almost reflective, as if her question had touched a memory he did not usually revisit. And he answered without hesitation, "You do not." And Sophie frowned slightly, confused, but before she could respond, he continued, his voice still even, You just make sure that when the moment comes, you do the same for someone else. And the simplicity of that answer settled over her in a way she did not expect. Because it was not a transaction, it was not a favor to be returned, it was something else entirely, something that extended beyond this single moment. And Sophie nodded slowly, her eyes filling again, but this time not from desperation, from something warmer, something steadier. And as the boarding call repeated, she realized she had to move, she had to go, so she took a step back, holding the boarding pass close, and said, "Thank you." The words feeling far too small for what they were meant to carry. But they were all she had, and Alexander gave a slight nod in return, as if that was enough, as if he expected nothing more. And then he turned away again, blending back into the movement of the airport, becoming just another figure among many, while Sophie stood there for one last second, watching him disappear, knowing that this moment, this stranger, and this unexpected act would stay with her long after the flight, long after this day. And with that, she took a deep breath, turned toward the gate, and began to run, not away from something this time, but toward the chance she had almost lost. Sophie Bennett could feel her heartbeat in her ears as she reached the boarding gate, the sound of it almost louder than the final call announcement echoing through the terminal. And for a brief second she slowed down, catching her breath as she handed her boarding pass to the agent, half expecting something to go wrong, as if this sudden turn of events might unravel just as quickly as it had come together. But the agent scanned the ticket, gave a polite nod, and said, "You're good to go." And just like that, the barrier that had felt impossible only minutes ago disappeared, and Sophie stepped onto the jet bridge, the narrow hallway stretching ahead of her like a quiet transition between two completely different realities. And as she walked, her grip on her phone tightened, her thoughts immediately shifting back to the reason she had fought so hard to get on this flight. Her son, Liam, and the last message she had received earlier that day replayed in her mind. The nurse's calm but urgent voice explaining that he had been asking for her, that he was scared, that it would mean everything if she could be there tonight. And Sophie swallowed hard, blinking back tears again. But this time they were mixed with relief, because now she had a chance. Now she was not too late. And as she stepped onto the plane, the soft hum of the cabin and the warm greeting from the flight attendant felt almost surreal compared to the chaos she had just left behind. She moved down the aisle quickly, counting the rows until she found her seat. And when she finally sat down, her body seemed to release all at once, the tension draining from her shoulders as she leaned back, closing her eyes for just a moment, trying to process everything that had happened. And in that quiet pause, Alexander's words echoed in her mind. You just make sure that when the moment comes, you do the same for someone else. And she repeated it silently, as if trying to understand the weight behind it, because it was not just advice. It felt like something more, something intentional. And as the plane began to fill with passengers, the ordinary sounds of people settling in, placing bags in overhead bins, fastening seat belts, filled the space, grounding her back in the present. But even then, she could not shake the feeling that what had just happened was more than coincidence, that there was something about the way he had looked at her, something almost familiar in the way he had spoken, as if her situation had touched something deeply personal. And Sophie opened her eyes again, staring out the small, oval window as the runway lights flickered in the distance, her reflection faintly visible against the glass. And for the first time all day, she allowed herself to breathe fully, to believe that she was actually on her way, that she would see Liam, that she would not miss this moment that mattered more than anything else. And yet, even as relief settled in, a quiet question lingered in the back of her mind. Who is Alexander really? And why had this moment seemed so important to him? And back inside the terminal, far from the noise of the boarding gate, Alexander Hayes walked at the same calm pace he always maintained, but this time his attention was not on the people around him. It was on something internal, something reflective, as he reached into his pocket and briefly held the same black card before slipping it away again, his expression unchanged to anyone passing by. But beneath that composed exterior, a memory had already resurfaced, one he had not revisited in years. A moment from a different time, a different airport, where the roles had been reversed and the outcome had not been the same. And as he continued walking, disappearing into the crowd once more, it became clear that for him, this had never been just about a ticket. The plane had just begun to taxi when Sophie Bennett felt her phone vibrate in her hand. And even though she knew she was supposed to switch it to airplane mode, something in her chest told her to check it. And when she looked down at the screen and saw the hospital number calling again, her heart dropped instantly, her fingers trembling as she answered in a hushed voice, "Hello." And on the other end, the nurse spoke quickly but gently, explaining that Liam had been asking for her again, that he had woken up and seemed more anxious, that he kept looking at the door as if expecting her to walk in at any second. And Sophie closed her eyes tightly, pressing the phone closer as she whispered, "I am on my way. I am on the plane right now." And for a moment, she thought that would be enough, that just knowing she was coming would bring some comfort. But then the nurse added something that made her chest tighten even more. "We're doing everything we can to keep him calm, but it would really help if you could talk to him." And Sophie hesitated, glancing around as the flight attendants began their final checks, her mind racing between the rules and the urgency of the moment. And then she nodded to herself, making a decision she did not even question. "Please, put him on the phone," she said softly, and seconds later, she heard Liam's small voice, weak but unmistakable, "Mom?" And everything inside her shifted instantly. The fear, the exhaustion, the doubt, all replaced by something stronger, something steady, and she smiled through tears as she said, "Hey, sweetheart, I'm coming to you right now. I'm already on the plane." And there was a pause, a fragile silence, before he asked, "Really?" And Sophie nodded even though he could not see her, her voice firm now. "Yes, I promise, I am on my way." And for the first time since the call began, she heard a hint of relief in his voice, a small but powerful change that made everything worth it. And after a few more words, she ended the call, just as the announcement reminded passengers to turn off all devices. Her hands still shaking, but her heart more grounded than it had been all day. And as the plane finally lifted off the runway, Sophie looked out the window, watching the city lights grow smaller beneath her, holding onto the image as if it marked the distance between where she had been and where she was going. But just as she began to settle into that fragile sense of relief, the first unexpected announcement came over the speaker, the captain's voice calm but serious, explaining that due to weather conditions at their destination, there might be a delay upon arrival. And Sophie felt her stomach drop again, her fingers tightening around the armrest as she tried to process what that could mean, because every minute mattered. Every delay felt like time slipping through her hands again, and the uncertainty crept back in, not as overwhelming as before, but sharp enough to remind her that nothing was guaranteed yet. And as the flight continued, Sophie tried to stay calm, repeating to herself that she was already closer than she had been, that she had made it this far. But the second wave of tension came hours later when the plane began its descent and the announcement confirmed what she had feared, that they would need to circle before landing due to congestion and weather, adding more time, more waiting, more distance between her and Liam. And Sophie closed her eyes again, gripping the small pendant around her neck, silently urging the plane to land, to move faster, to give her just enough time, because after everything that happened, after everything that stranger had done for her, she could not bear the thought of still being too late. When the plane finally touched down, Sophie Bennett felt the impact not just beneath her seat but deep in her chest, as if her entire body had been holding its breath for this exact moment. And the second the wheels met the runway, she opened her eyes, gripping the armrest as the engines roared in reverse, slowing them down, and all she could think was that she had made it. She was here. She was finally in the same city as her son. But even as that thought settled in, reality quickly followed, because landing was not the same as arriving. And as the plane taxied toward the gate at what felt like an unbearable pace, every second stretched longer than it should have, and Sophie leaned forward slightly, as if that alone could somehow make the aircraft move faster, her eyes fixed on the window, watching the airport lights pass by one, each one a reminder that she was still not there yet. And when the seatbelt sign finally turned off, she was already unbuckled before the chime had fully sounded, standing up along with dozens of other passengers, But unlike them, she was not thinking about luggage or connections or anything ordinary. She was thinking about Liam, about the sound of his voice on the phone, about the way he had asked if she was really coming. And that promise echoed louder now than anything else. And as the aisle slowly inched forward, the familiar frustration of waiting returned. But this time it was sharper, more urgent, and Sophie glanced at the overhead. Bins calculating whether she could leave her small bag behind just to move faster. But instinct told her she might need it later, so she held on, shifting her weight impatiently as the line crawled forward step by step, until finally she reached the exit door, stepping out into the jet bridge and immediately quickening. Her pace, almost breaking into a run, her shoes echoing against the floor as she followed the signs toward baggage claim and then toward the exit, her phone already in her hand again, turning it back on, waiting for signal, waiting for any update. And as the screen lit up, multiple notifications appeared at once, missed calls, messages, and her heart skipped as she opened the most recent one from the hospital, her eyes scanning quickly, and for a brief, terrifying second, she froze because the message read, "Please call us as soon as you land." And nothing else, no explanation, no detail, just that simple line that left too much room for fear, and Sophie felt the air leave her lungs as she immediately dialed the number, her steps slowing despite her urgency, because suddenly she was afraid of what she might hear, but she forced herself to keep moving, weaving through the crowd as the call connected, each ring stretching longer than it should, until finally someone answered. And Sophie spoke first, her voice tight. "This is Sophie Bennett. I just landed. I got your message. How is my son?" And there was a brief pause on the other end. Not long, but long enough to make her heart race all over again. And then the nurse responded, her tone calm but careful. "He is stable, but he's been asking for you nonstop. We told him you were on your way." And Sophie closed her eyes for a second, relief washing over her so quickly it almost made her dizzy. But there was no time to stop, no time to process because she was not there yet. And she asked quickly, "How far is the hospital from the airport?" Already knowing she needed to move faster than ever. And as she reached the exit doors and stepped outside into the cool night air, the next challenge was already waiting, because the line for taxis stretched longer than she expected, a long row of people standing under the dim lights, all waiting, all with somewhere to go. And Sophie felt that familiar pressure return, that same ticking clock she thought she had left behind. And for a split second, doubt crept back in, not about whether she would get there, but whether she would get there in time, and just as she tightened her grip on her phone, scanning for any faster option, a black car slowly pulled up to the curb nearby, stopping just a few feet away from where she stood, its presence quiet but deliberate, as if it had arrived with a purpose she had not yet realized. The black car idled quietly at the curb, its engine barely audible beneath the distant hum of traffic and rolling suitcases, and at first Sophie Bennett did not think it had anything to do with her, because nothing about her situation felt important enough to attract something like that, not after everything she had already been through that day. But then the rear window slowly lowered, and a driver in a clean dark suit leaned slightly toward her, his voice calm and direct as he said, "MS. Bennett?" And Sophie froze for a second, her name sounding unfamiliar in that moment, as if it did not belong in this setting. And she looked around instinctively, half expecting him to be speaking to someone else. But there was no one else reacting, no one else stepping forward, and she pointed to herself slightly, confused. "Me?" And the driver gave a small nod, already stepping out of the car and moving toward her with purpose. "Yes, ma'am. I've been instructed to take you to St. Mary's Hospital." And Sophie felt her heartbeat spike again, not with fear, but with disbelief, because nothing about this made sense, not the timing, not the precision, not the fact that someone had arranged this without her knowledge. And her first instinct was to question it, to hesitate, because she had learned not to trust things that seemed too good to be true. But then the driver added one more sentence that changed everything. "Mr. Hayes asked me to make sure you get there as quickly as possible." And in that instant, everything connected, the airport, the black car, the calm certainty in his voice. and Sophie felt a wave of realization wash over her so quickly it almost made her lightheaded. Because this was not just a random act anymore. This was intentional. This was someone continuing to show up even after the moment had passed. And without wasting another second, she nodded, her voice filled with urgency and gratitude as she said, "Yes, please." And the driver opened the door for her, and Sophie stepped inside, the interior quiet and comfortable, a sharp contrast to the chaos she had been navigating all day. But she barely noticed any of it, because her focus had already shifted forward again, toward the hospital, toward Liam. And as the car pulled away from the curb, merging smoothly into traffic, Sophie leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped together as if holding onto the seconds themselves, watching the city pass by through the window. Street lights streaking softly across the glass, each one marking progress, each one bringing her closer. And the driver spoke again, his tone reassuring. "We should be there in about 15 minutes, and Sophie nodded quickly, doing the math in her head, calculating distance, time, possibility, and for the first time since the plane had landed, something inside her began to settle, not completely, not fully, but enough to let her breathe just a little easier. And as the car moved through intersections and past rows of buildings, Sophie found herself thinking about Alexander again, about the way he had appeared and disappeared, about the way he seemed to anticipate what she needed before she even realized it herself. And it raised a question she could not ignore anymore. How did he know? How did he know where she was going? What she needed, what mattered most? And that question lingered as they approached the hospital, the large building coming into view ahead, its lights glowing steadily against the night sky. And as the car slowed to a stop right at the entrance, before Sophie could even reach for the handle, the driver turned slightly and said, "You should go. They are expecting you." And Sophie did not hesitate. She opened the door and stepped out immediately, her feet hitting the ground with purpose, her eyes fixed on the entrance just a few yards away. And as she began to move, almost running now, she paused for just a fraction of a second, turning back toward the car, her voice filled with emotion as she said, "Please tell him, thank you." And the driver gave a respectful nod. "I will." And with that, Sophie turned again and rushed inside, the automatic doors sliding open in front of her as she crossed the threshold, leaving behind the night, the car, and the unanswered questions, and stepping directly into the moment she had been racing toward all along. Sophie Bennett pushed through the hospital doors, her breath uneven but her steps unwavering, the bright lights of the lobby washing over her as everything became sharply focused. The front desk, the waiting chairs, the quiet urgency that filled the air, and before she could even speak, a nurse approached her, as if she had been expecting this exact moment. "Sophie Bennett?" she asked gently, and Sophie nodded immediately, her voice catching as she replied, "Yes, where is he?" And the nurse gave a small, reassuring smile, already motioning for her to follow. "He is awake. He has been asking for you." And those words alone were enough to carry Sophie forward, her pace quickening as they moved down the hallway, past doors and monitors and the soft hum of machines, each step bringing her closer to the moment she had been holding on to since the airport. And when they finally reached the room, the nurse paused just long enough to open the door, and Sophie stepped inside, her eyes immediately finding him, Liam, small against the hospital bed, but unmistakably there, unmistakably present. And the second he saw her, his face lit up in a way that erased every mile, every delay, every moment of doubt. "Mom," he said softly, and that single word broke whatever tension remained inside her, and she moved to his side without hesitation, taking his hand carefully, holding it as if it were the most important thing in the world, because to her, it was, and she smiled through tears, her voice warm and steady now. "I told you I would make it." And Liam nodded slightly, his grip tightening just enough to let her know he believed her, that he had been waiting, and for a while, nothing else mattered. Not the flight, not the stranger, not the questions still lingering in her mind, just this moment, just being there, just keeping her promise. And as the minutes passed, Sophie listened as the nurse quietly explained that Liam was stable, that he had been scared earlier but was now resting more comfortably. And each word, settled into her like a reassurance she had been needing all day, and she stayed by his side, brushing his hair back gently, speaking softly to him, telling him she was not going anywhere, not now, not anymore, and eventually, as his eyes grew heavier, Liam drifted into sleep, his breathing steady, his hand still loosely holding hers, and Sophie remained there, watching him, letting the silence settle, letting herself finally feel the full weight of everything that had happened. And it was in that quiet moment that the door opened again, and a doctor stepped inside, greeting her with a polite nod before speaking in a calm, professional tone, updating her on Liam's condition, explaining the next steps, the treatments, the expectations. And Sophie listened carefully, absorbing every detail, asking questions when she needed to, determined to understand everything, to be present in every way that mattered. And when the conversation ended, the doctor added something that made her pause, something that did not quite fit with everything else. "By the way," he said, almost as an afterthought, "your expenses for tonight have already been taken care of." And Sophie blinked, confused because she knew she had not arranged anything like that. And she asked quietly, "What do you mean?" And the doctor glanced briefly at his notes before responding. The initial fees, the room, and immediate care, they had been covered. And Sophie felt that familiar wave of disbelief return, stronger this time, because this was no longer just about a plane ticket or a ride to the hospital. This was something much bigger, something that extended far beyond a single act of kindness. And as the doctor finished and stepped out of the room, Sophie remained still for a moment, her eyes slowly shifting back to Liam, then to the doorway, and finally to the space around her, as if trying to piece together something she could not yet fully understand. And in that silence, one thought became impossible to ignore. Alexander Hayes had not just helped her once, he'd been quietly clearing the path for her every step of the way. And the question was no longer why he helped her in that moment at the airport. The question now was how far that help actually reached. Sophie Bennett sat quietly beside Liam's bed, her hand still resting gently over his, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing as the room settled into a calm she had not felt in what seemed like forever. And for the first time since that morning, there was no immediate crisis pulling her in a different direction, no countdown pressing against her chest, just a quiet stillness that allowed her thoughts to finally catch up. And naturally, they returned to him, to Alexander Hayes, because everything that happened since the airport now felt connected in a way that could not be ignored. The ticket, the car, the hospital, each step unfolding as if someone had already anticipated what she would need before she even realized it herself. And Sophie glanced down at her phone, turning it slowly in her hand as she considered what to do next. Because gratitude alone did not feel like enough anymore. She needed to understand, not just for herself, but for the promise she had silently made the moment she stepped on that plane. And after a moment of hesitation, she stood up carefully, making sure Liam was still resting peacefully before stepping out into the hallway. The soft lighting and quiet footsteps of hospital staff creating a space where everything felt slightly more reflective, and she approached the front desk, her voice calm but purposeful as she asked, "Excuse me, do you know who arranged the payment for my son's care?" And the receptionist looked up, typing briefly before nodding. Yes, it was handled through a private account earlier tonight. And Sophie took a small breath, her next question coming more quickly now. Was there a name attached to it? And the receptionist hesitated just slightly before answering. Alexander Hayes. And hearing it spoken out loud in this place, in this moment, made everything feel even more real, more intentional. And Sophie nodded slowly, thanking her before stepping back, her mind now fully focused on one thing. She needed to find him, not because she owed him something, but because there was a story here she had not been told. And as she walked back toward Liam's room, she paused when she noticed a television mounted in the corner of the waiting area, the screen displaying a business news segment. And she might have walked past it without a second thought, if not for the name that suddenly caught her attention, Alexander Hayes. And Sophie stopped instantly, her eyes locking onto the screen as the anchor spoke about a major announcement involving Hayes Global, about expansion, leadership, influence, words that felt distant and unrelated to the man she had met earlier. And then his image appeared, clear and unmistakable, the same calm expression, the same steady presence, but now framed in a completely different context identified. Not just as a man, but as one of the most influential CEOs in the country, and Sophie felt a quiet shock settle in. Not because he was wealthy, she had already sensed that, but because of how effortlessly he had stepped out of that identity when he helped her, how none of that power had been visible in the moment she needed it most. And as the segment continued, mentioning his reputation for privacy and selective philanthropy, Sophie understood something she had not fully grasped before. This was not about recognition. This was not about being seen. This was about something personal, something rooted in a past she had only glimpsed through a single sentence. And slowly, Sophie turned away from the screen, her thoughts clearer now, her emotions steadier. And as she stepped back into Liam's room, returning to his side, she gently took his hand again, a small smile forming as she whispered softly, more to herself than anyone else, "When the moment comes," and she paused, letting the words settle, knowing that one day, in some way she could not yet predict, she would recognize that moment when it arrived, and when it did, she would not hesitate because now she understood that what Alexander Hayes had given her was more than help. It was a direction, a quiet responsibility that would carry forward long after this night was over. In one of the most powerful, touching stories you will ever hear, a struggling single mother faces a heartbreaking moment at an airport when she cannot afford a plane ticket to reach her sick child, only for a mysterious billionaire to step in with a quiet act of kindness that changes everything. This emotional journey unfolds through unexpected turns as the single mother battles time, distance, and fear, while the billionaire continues to help from the shadows, arranging not only her flight, but also her urgent ride, and even covering hospital expenses without asking for anything in return, making this one of those rare, touching stories that highlight how a single decision can ripple through someone's life in ways beyond imagination. As the story progresses, the bond between desperation and hope becomes clear, showing how the single mother's determination to reach her child fuels every step, while the billionaire's past quietly shapes his actions, creating a deeper layer that makes this one of the most unforgettable, touching stories centered on compassion and unseen generosity. From the tension of delayed flights to the emotional reunion at the hospital, every moment builds toward a powerful realization that kindness does not need recognition to be meaningful, reinforcing why audiences are drawn to touching stories that reflect real human emotion and connection. In the end, what remains is not just gratitude, but a lasting message carried forward by the single mother, proving that the impact of one stranger's help can echo far beyond a single night, making this story stand among the most inspiring, touching stories that remind us how empathy and timing can change lives forever. Character 1, a 28-year-old white American single mother, front-facing view, natural lighting, wearing simple, worn casual clothes, tired eyes yet gentle expression, realistic skin texture, emotional presence, airport setting, no CGI, no illustration, no cartoon, cinematic realism, authentic human details. Character 2, a 39-year-old white American billionaire CEO, front-facing view, sharp defined facial features, calm, confident expression, tailored dark suit, clean hairstyle, natural. Lighting, realistic skin texture, luxury subtly background, no CGI, no illustration, no cartoon, cinematic realism,